Be a very quick informal video. I realized that going towards the fairy tale analysis assignment, there are some of these psychological terms that maybe we didn't talk about as much as others. And some of these relate to Annabel Lee, which is one of the reasons I wanted to introduce this poem. So just in case we don't have enough time to get into all of this in class, I want to make some quick connections. First, let's talk quickly about the poem. So in this first stanza, the speaker is describing Annabel Lee, and he claims that this maiden she lived with no other thought than to love and be loved by me. So she's entirely consumed with and defined by love of the speaker. I was a child and she was a child in this kingdom by the sea, but we loved with a love that was more than love, I and my Annabel Lee, with a love that the winged seraphs of heaven coveted her and me. All right, so far, maybe a typical kind of poem that gives a very courtly love sort of vision of idealized love that feels superior to other forms, right? But let's look for psychological stuff, right? We loved with a love that was more than love. So this is a kind of extreme, as we see in negative forms in other Poe stories, like with vengeance or hatred or madness. We have this kind of extreme form of love. And we have this interesting phrase, I was a child and she was a child, which we can assume is probably metaphorical, right? Usually children don't fall in love with each other. But what he means is maybe they felt like children in that moment in terms of the purity or the innocence of their love, or the way that perhaps they were single-minded about it, or maybe they went back to a kind of spontaneous joy that reminded them of childhood. But when we see this reference to childhood, right, we should think about psychological development, right? Children think in very different ways than we do, and we know, especially with a Freudian view, that like childhood development maybe has a really, really big impact on our future psychological development, on who we become as people, and that maybe some of our psychological problems can come from maybe not developing in the typical way or in the fully developed proper way. And this was the reason that long ago in this kingdom by the sea, a wind blew out of a cloud, chilling my beautiful Annabel Lee, so that her highborn kinsman came and bore her away from me to shut her up in a sepulchre in this kingdom by the sea. So again, metaphorically, he's describing the illness and death, the sudden unexpected illness and death of his love, Annabel Lee. But he uses kind of analogy here, using this kind of fairy tale language. So he's not talking about it directly. He's using fantasy to kind of deal with what happened, to address it, to come up with some kind of explanation for it. This idea that the winged seraphs, the angels of heaven, were jealous, right, and kind of stole her away. And again, this kind of fairy tale vision is emphasizing the idealized nature of the love that he may have had for her, and vice versa. So again, we have this idea of the angels being jealous, as I alluded to, explicated in this stanza. But our love, it was stronger by far than the love of those who were older than we, of many far wiser than we, and neither the angels in heaven above nor the demons down under the sea can ever dissever my soul from the soul of the beautiful Annabel Lee. So we have a kind of defiance here. His love, or their love, is stronger than every other love. And we have them, their sort of youthful innocence, contrasted with the older and the wiser, maybe conventional values of society. They stand alone in defiance of that. And we have this idea that the souls are intertwined, this image of the souls never being able to be dissevered, right? So to sever something, it's almost like it's the same organism that would need to be torn apart. So his soul and her soul are almost like one thing. Very romantic idea, right? For the moon never beams without bringing me dreams of the beautiful Annabel Lee, and the stars never rise, but I feel the bright eyes of the beautiful Annabel Lee. So he's kind of saying that even though she's dead, he doesn't sense that she's gone. She still continues to live in him and in nature and the things that nature inspires him with. And we have this kind of fantastical element of the poem that, again, maybe seems metaphorical or is metaphorical, but maybe has an element of something that the speaker really feels or really wants to believe, that she has perhaps some kind of eternal soul that is alive and that is represented in nature. And so all the night tide I lie down by the side of my darling, my life and my bride, in her sepulchre there by the sea, in her tomb by the sounding sea. So we have every night, all night, he's lying next to her tomb. kind of missing her or feeling like he's still with her even though she's dead. Now, this is the part that's probably most Gothic in the poem, right? This idea of lying next to a tomb. If someone did this in real life, they might be arrested, right? Or they'd be referred to some psychological counseling, right? So in the context of a romantic poem, we might not be surprised by this kind of, we might call it an exaggeration of the feelings of love, or a hyperbolic representation. But let's say that, in fact, this is an honest representation of how the speaker here feels. What elements do we see that are psychological? Well, let's go through the list a little bit. This is the main point here. Right? So just to reiterate what some of these mean, I think psychology, psychoanalysis, id, ego, superego, we talked about these a lot. So with the ego, it's this idea of a conscious self existing in balance. We could say that perhaps the speaker here is not so balanced because his ego is not strong in the sense of being independent and self-reliant. It is very bound up with his love for Annabel Lee and with the memory of her. And it does seem that he's having some trouble developing or moving forward in his life, or is even stubbornly refusing to do so. In a realistic sense, right, in a modern psychological sense, we might say that the healthy thing for him to do is to perhaps move on, right, to experience grief, and then to go and maybe find another love, or find something else to focus on that's more positive or constructive in his life. But he's not doing that, right? We have this idea of psychosexual development, right? Something that's very key in the fairy tales. This kind of is saying that part of our maturity has to do with how our sexuality develops as well. So maybe some of these kinds of early relationships or attachments are really, really important. So this connects to the idea that maybe this first love, maybe truly his first love or his most innocent love, or that he's now idealizing, are holding back his psychosexual development and therefore holding back his complete development as a person and maybe causing some psychological problems. So we have the idea of the id and the idea of the unconscious, right? The aspects of our minds that we're not aware of. We analogize that in class to an iceberg, with the unconscious mind as well as parts of the superego and id being under the sea. And we have the sea imagery here in this poem, right? He's sleeping there by the sea. And the woman, the object of his desire, Annabel Lee, lives in a kingdom by the sea. So we have this connection to the sea, connection to the unconscious, or to the id, that our speaker's focus or life or mentality seems to be very much dwelling in, right? So he's not strongly in that ego-defined real world. He's closer to that unconscious sea, right? That powerful, irrational sense of feelings. And we have this term neurotic, which again refers to this idea of the sort of id, ego, superego being kind of unbalanced in a way that results in a troubled psyche and negative feelings. So he does seem to possibly be feeling some negative feelings here. Okay, so this is a new one we haven't talked much about. Differentiation and ego formation. Okay, so according to Freud, we first develop an ego, which we could define as a conscious self or a self-conception, right? What we think of as ourselves. We first develop this when we recognize ourselves as distinct from our mothers and our environment. So this is the idea that babies or infants, they don't have a self-conception, and we can kind of see that obviously in the way that they act, and that they experience the world as a way of that they are not necessarily separate objects from other things in the world, and most strongly from the mother, right, who we are evolved to have this strong bonding, pairing instinct with in order for nourishment, for survival in those early years where we're so vulnerable. So especially in the early years, right, this differentiation and ego formation is really important. And is further built and strengthened through establishment of things like values and who we are in relation to others. We have a kind of, it would seem, in our speaker here, a resistance to differentiation, right? From Annabel Lee, who is someone who he has formed an extreme entanglement with, an extreme attachment with, and in his mind, vice versa as well. And his values do not help differentiate him from that, because his values are romantic. They are valuing the love itself, the connection itself, the kind of even loss or dissolution of the ego that comes with being in this kind of love relationship. He values those things, and therefore he's not able to value other more practical things that might help him develop a stronger ego or separate himself from the memory of Annabel Lee. Right? And likewise, who he is in relation to others, well, he doesn't seem to have relationships with other people. He's really completely defined by this relationship with Annabel Lee, even though she's dead, which we could say is maybe unhealthy. So defense mechanisms, we talked about a lot of those. So we'll talk about, he seems to be using some of those here. We'll talk about them in more detail. We talked about the eros, the pleasure principle, and the death drive, and how these kind of work in a strange balance with each other. Right? So pleasure principle would drive us towards enjoyment and against discipline. Well, he doesn't seem to be very disciplined here, right? He seems, again, stubbornly willful in clinging to this love, but he is longing for something that he can't have. Again, his life seems defined by this. There's some pleasure principle here, and oddly, it does seem to be bound up with both eros and the death drive, right? So eros is something we associate with love, right? Like maybe one of the things that motivates us in life is the drive towards greater connections with other people, like reproduction, getting higher status in society that might help us achieve those things. But for our speaker here, that's totally bound up with the death drive. Because Annabel Lee is dead, right, the thing that is leading him towards bonding and love is also leading him towards something that is dead, right? Something that by definition cannot help him move forward in life or reproduce or anything like that. So we see a kind of self-destructive aspect in a lot of Poe's narrators, and perhaps we see that manifested through the feelings of love of the speaker here. Even though we think of love as a good thing, maybe there is a dark edge to it. Can we imagine that maybe even he loves her more because she's dead, right? Is the fact that she's dead allow him to idealize this love even more, to be able to let his entire sort of conscious life be dissolved in this memory, this very diffuse, idealized memory? Is his love affair with death, or the kind of death? As he is lying there next to her tomb every night, is the thing that he's really desiring is to be reunited with her in death, right? Is he kind of waiting to die or in love with the idea of dying himself? And is there something that death has in common with that kind of ego dissolution that we get from a very intense attachment with another person? Complicated idea. But yeah, it all relates to this idea of attachment, and attachment being kind of really one of the most intense psychological things we can experience in our lives, and one of the instincts that defines us as humans, right? So we're emotionally charged in our bonding with parental figures when we're very young, subsequently with maybe peers in childhood and adolescence, and then as we get a little older, our lives can become very defined by our romantic attachments or marital attachments. So if you have trouble with those things, it's very hard to be happy, often. Trauma is emotional shock following a highly stressful event. So we associate trauma with people who have experienced things like violence, like people who are veterans of war who suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder. But in fact, we all experience some form of trauma in our relationships, right? So if we experience a breakup, for instance, that is traumatic. If we experience the loss of a loved one, that is also very traumatic. His trauma here is the sudden death of Annabel Lee, which he really hasn't gotten over. Repression, a defense mechanism that prevents unacceptable thoughts and memories from entering the unconscious mind. That may be present here. We've talked about that before. Denial. Yeah, possibly he's in denial, right? About the idea that she's gone, right? About the idea that they can't continue their relationship. About the idea that maybe his continued attachment is unhealthy. Projection, we've talked a bit about. Displacing one's own feeling onto a different person, animal, or object. He seems to be imagining a certain sympathy or association between the moon and the stars and Annabel Lee herself. It's not exactly projection, I'm not sure, but it has some parallels. Cognitive dissonance, we've discussed. Perverse, behavior that seems to go against rational or moral standards, or is inexplicably self-defeating. So we could say that his continued obsession or fixation on Annabel Lee, right, is attempt to kind of continue their relationship in his mind and his spirit is in some way perverse because it is not healthy, it is not constructive, it's not helping him achieve any practical goals in the world. and it is bizarre behavior by normal societal standards. All right, and now we get into the Jungian stuff, collective unconscious. So this is from Carl Jung, who's the slightly more mystical and literary disciple or student of Freud. They have some differences of opinion, but it's always interesting to explore Jung's ideas. So Jung has this idea of the part of the unconscious mind which is derived from ancestral memory and is common to all humankind, as distinct from the individual's unconscious. So we talked about that image of the sea and how that functions as a symbol, as a metaphor, perhaps part of the powerful imagery of this poem. Perhaps the sea doesn't simply represent here an individual's unconscious, perhaps it represents the collective, undifferentiated unconscious. Right? Perhaps it's something that we all are connected to, even in a very mystical sense, if we wanted to go down that road before we're born or after we die. People who try to look at things from a spiritual perspective and look at things like quantum mechanics even can say, well, our cells or the energy that makes up our bodies or our minds never totally is destroyed. It just kind of diffuses into the universe. Do we see that kind of idea present in the idea that Annabel Lee's eyes are there in the stars, the distant stars, or in the way that we're drawn to the sea? Complex idea, but very poetic. Archetypes are again connected to the collective unconscious. So we talked a lot about these with Alice, and they're definitely there with fairy tales. These are these sort of, in literary terms, any repeated elements that sort of naturally make sense to us, right? Like the idea that we keep telling stories about certain kinds of heroes, or we naturally empathize with certain kinds of characters, or that different cultures naturally associate snakes with something sinister, for instance. It seems to follow a pattern, and this would seem to be evidence for some kind of collective unconscious or shared set of memories and instincts. This poem employs, I would say, consciously many archetypes. So it has those fairy tale archetypes of the kingdom by the sea with a ruler, and the archetype of the kind of idealized, young, innocent love who can define the protagonist, right, that we see in so many fairy tales. And the idea of her being kind of kept away or locked away by her father, the king, or kinsman, and needing to be rescued by the hero. But of course, in this case, the hero can't rescue her because she's in fact dead, but he's dedicated to her anyway. This idea of the angels, kind of these godlike figures kind of representing fate that we see in the poem. These are archetypes as well. We see these represented in the kind of spiritual beliefs of pretty much any culture in the world. This idea that there's some more powerful force that is acting on us that can give or take away life as it pleases. And yeah, there's others in play here as well. We could say that the speaker is himself an archetype of perhaps profound dedication and all-consuming love, and this connection between love and death that we see in a lot of mythology, for instance. Individuation. This is very connected to that idea of differentiation and ego formation that we mentioned earlier. Process where an individual self develops out of an undifferentiated unconscious. Okay? So the idea that there's this kind of primordial sea, if you will, of common unconscious that we all emerge from as individualized beings. Okay? And perhaps we see in the speaker here a desire to go back to that in some sense, right? Represented by the sea, represented by the sort of dissolution of the self in his love for Annabel Lee. Pseudoscience we talked about, pop psychology we talked about, depression. So depression is an impairment of function in some way connected to negative feelings, especially loss and grief. Used to be called things like melancholy. We could say that we definitely see that here in the speaker, who doesn't seem to be feeling very good, and who seems to be characterized by kind of pining for his love. Paranoia is an interesting one. We see this in society a lot today. Delusions of persecution, unwarranted jealousy, or exaggerated self-importance, typically worked into an organized system. Many different things can cause this, including very serious mental disorders, but it's also an aspect of the way all of our minds work. We see paranoia in this poem, I would say. Rather than simply accepting or saying that she died and it's a random instance of fate or something like that, he makes up this narrative that, in fact, that the angels, these sort of personified uh, powerful forces were conspiring against him and Annabel Lee specifically, right? This reflects this idea of exaggerated self-importance that we see in his whole characterization of their love. He believes that their love is better than other people's love, more powerful. It's the real love, whereas other love is not real. And they understand love better than the supposedly older and wiser people. Okay? And he refuses to kind of follow these normal social standards of sort of grief and moving on. All of this could be seen as exaggerated self-importance, and that sort of fantasy of the angels being jealous and stealing her away supports that sense of exaggerated self-importance and rationalizes it, in a sense, through this sort of paranoid fantasy. So obsession, this is the one that most people would kind of say right away, well, yeah, he's clearly obsessed with Annabel Lee. And he is in a sense, although we should differentiate the idea of obsession as a psychological disorder, which often deals with actually thinking about things that really disturb us as opposed to things that kind of make us happy. So with obsession, we see that within the Telltale Heart, for instance. The protagonist can't stop thinking about that weird-looking eye that the old man has, and it really bothers him. So that's why he wants to kill the old man, because it produces these feelings of anxiety and disgust. So by that definition, actually, we wouldn't exactly see obsession in psychological terms in this poem. Rather, we might have a kind of fixation or something else. Narcissism, again, involves... this one's a tricky one to define. You might see many different definitions of it, but it, again, involves this idea of an aggrandized sense of self-importance, and again, this idea of not quite differentiating the self from other people. So people who are kind of narcissistic, they see themselves in others, maybe, rather than recognizing other people fully as like independent beings. So perhaps the narrators, or rather the speakers, the speaker's idealization, extreme idealization of Annabel Lee here, represents his own narcissism. Right? The extremity of his attachment and his almost worship of Annabel Lee and his total attachment to her is, in many ways, we could say, narcissistic. Right? Interestingly, we don't find out anything specific about Annabel Lee. We don't even know her appearance. All we know is the feeling of love that the speaker has towards her and the extreme idealization that he kind of presents in terms of her. We could definitely say all of this is narcissistic, and narcissism is more characteristic of younger people. Kids are more narcissistic, and teens are more narcissistic than adults usually. So this relates again to that idea of differentiation being kind of in some ways, a lifelong process, or a process that goes on through our whole psychosexual development. And his refusal, the speaker's refusal to maybe recognize that maybe the idealized nature of Annabel Lee herself, or of their love, is kind of coming from himself, and maybe is even kind of immature in some way. His refusal to recognize that represents his immaturity and possibly clinging on to a kind of narcissism. Compartmentalization we've discussed. Sublimation we've discussed. And regression is interesting here. A defense mechanism involving returning to an earlier stage of development in terms of thinking or behavior in response to a stressful situation. Perhaps we see hints of that here in the way that the speaker's attachment to Annabel Lee is almost like a totally dependent, almost infantile attachment. Right? He almost can't survive without her. So in dealing with the trauma of her death, he is perhaps regressed into a state of like total childlike kind of dependence. He also seems to really idealize, again, this kind of idea of innocence and purity that is connected with childhood. So this would all, again, relate to possibly some regression, or at least some kind of stubborn refusal or inability to move on and kind of develop a more balanced and mature adult and less romantic view of things. So as I guess, this was slightly more long-winded than I initially planned, but I hope that's helpful. I did just want to take time to go over all of these terms so that you guys can potentially use them in your fairy tale analyses. And please do. I encourage you to, in fact, engage with as many of these as possible, especially during the brainstorming process, before you decide on maybe just a few or one or two that seem to work better. And yeah, I also have a full presentation on this story that is recorded, on this poem rather, that is recorded. If you do want to have time to watch it later. And we'll talk about it a bit more in class. So let me know if you have any questions on it. And I'm also curious to hear your own ideas. Don't take everything I say as gospel here. It's just kind of a brainstorm. These are potential connections I see, not necessarily the definitive interpretations of this poem. And there's obviously a lot more to say about this poem as well that doesn't have to do with psychology. But I'll stop here. Thanks, guys.